So let's just, again, I'm just, for conscious of time, I'm not going to step through all of those, but what I've done is I've done the same assessment using the same table, but I've changed some of my assumptions. So instead of decommissioning after 25 years, I've said, no, let's not decommission until 50 years later. I've then said, well, I'm not sure how much my decommissioning is. Is it 500 million or is it 1,000 million? So I'm going to use that as an uncertainty question. I'm going to change my income, so instead of getting 150 million of revenue, maybe I can get 10% more because my electricity prices may get better. So I'm going to get 165 million. And also on the next slide, I'll show you what happens if you change the capital cost. So what you see is each of those kind of scenarios, each of the lines here show you, for example, the base case, if you remember, was 11 and minus 124. Now if I look at it and I decommission my reactor 50 years later, you now see that in fact now my present value, my net present value has gone up a lot. If I now look at, the assumption that my decommissioning cost has doubled, so gone from 500 to 1,000 million, you can see now that the cost, that the revenue has dropped a little bit, but not as much as it gained previously. But now look at 65 million for my income rather than 150 million that last line. I've now gone from, instead of only getting 11 million of net present value, I've now got 187 million, showing that project is really, really value. So what does all that tell you? In summary, again, for those who are not interested in equations and numbers, this is the key takeaway. The net present value of your project is incredibly sensitive to the income that you assume. In other words, from a nuclear project, the cost, the generating money, the income, the revenue you get from your electricity, so therefore your electricity selling price, is incredibly important to determine whether your project is viable or not. But the net present value is fairly insensitive to costs in turn that are incurred a long time in the future. And this is illustrating one of the big things about nuclear. A lot of people will say to you that decommissioning is such a problem for nuclear, we don't know how much it's going to cost. But in reality, if you put a little bit of money aside, because the decommissioning is so far in the future, it has very, very little effect on the overall benefit or not of the project. But you have to put a little money aside, and we'll come on back to that later. So moving on to what I said, that's not a good sign. I didn't do it. What happened? Emmanuel saved me from the Microsoft gods. Thank you. Okay, so let's do this capital assessment issue. So, for example, the capital cost could be, we may have got it wrong, maybe it's a reactor we haven't built before, so we get the estimate wrong. Maybe the person selling you the reactor tells you they want to win the contract, so they give you an underestimate and it goes up in price. Imagine that happening. Maybe there's unexpected additional costs that you didn't think would happen. Maybe you chose the wrong reactor design, you should have chosen a different one. But what I'm just showing here is that 1,000 was the first assumption. Again, you see that net present value of 11 and minus 124. But now let's see what happens if I increase the capital by only 5%. So I go from 1,000 to 1,050. And now look at it, the net present value has suddenly plummeted. It's dropped substantially. What happens if I was out by 10%? Look at that, it drops even more substantially, particularly for bigger discount rates. But if I manage to bring that project in a little bit under, so maybe 5% under cost, so 950 million, look how now my revenue, the positivity of the project jumps substantially. What does this tell you? What it tells you is that the net present value, the viability of your project, is very sensitive to the capital cost. And this is one of the key things that drives nuclear. So what I've talked you through about discounted cash flow analysis, you can apply to any project. Discounted cash flow analysis is not unique to nuclear. This is how every project is evaluated by banks, investors, and so on. But the key thing is, what I'm trying to highlight to you is what are the key questions you need to ask when considering the economics of nuclear. And capital cost is always, and remember the word cloud, most people recognize that capital cost was dominating, but maybe they didn't understand why, and this is why. It's because it's so sensitive, this net present value, because it's a large number, and it potentially you have to borrow money for a long period of time on a large number. That's why. It's one to watch. Okay, so as I keep mentioning, we've seen that this discount rate, do I assume 5%, do I assume 10%? It's incredibly sensitive to the overall outcome of your project assessment, as well as the capital cost. These are the two that dominate. So discount rate is a general term that gets applied to the interest rate. So for example, if I borrow lots of money, then that's the interest rate that I have to pay on that loan. But equally, it's also to take into account the borrowing as the money kind of comes down after the project started. So the key thing here to bear in mind is what number should you assume? In doing your assessment, what's the assumed discount rate that works for you? Well, the answer is it depends, because it's all, and I'll show you in a second what underpins this, but primarily the discount rate assumed is very much based on the assumed risk, the perceived risk of the project. And so this is where government involvement or loan guarantees, as we've heard about, can really make a big difference. If you go to the market, the general investment market, and you say, hey, I need a loan for nuclear, they're probably going to ask for about 12%. If you can go to your government or a government loan guarantee, they may be asking only for 5%. So 5% to 12%, you've seen in that analysis just how vitally important that set of assumptions is. So the key thing here is risk. If you can reduce the risk of your project, the perceived risk, you're more likely to be able to borrow money at a lower rate. It's the same as if you were building a house or anything else, yeah? So if you enter in as a risky house build, the loaner probably would ask for a little bit more return. So this is the key thing. So I'm going to now just drill down into what kind of underpins some of those capital cost assumptions and numbers. Try it one more time, there we go. Okay, so again, get your Mentimeter out. The number has reappeared at the top of the screen in case it kind of died previously, so hopefully everybody still has that available. But if not, you can go to mentimeter.com and then type in 21882. But from your perspective, the next question would be, from your perspective, what do you think is the greatest risk in the economics of nuclear? And I've just provided a list of some of the things that I often hear people talk about. Okay, so let's go to the Mentimeter. So you can start kind of prioritizing. So you can, on your Mentimeter now, you can click and drag the options into like the little box, and then you can rank them. So let's see what people think is the most. Is Mentimeter still working, by the way, to make sure we're still online? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, capital cost jumps in the first place early on. So this is really interesting because this, again, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is really about your perspective and your perception. And I'd like to just talk about some of those in a second to see what people think about. So capital cost, I've underlined that a lot, so I'm glad to see that's at the top. Generating income was one of the ones that I mentioned. Again, potential risk underlines that. So it's interesting to see those. Construction time, 100% great. What I like about this is the fact that I hopefully, some of my comments that are beginning to reinforce your previous thinking, that capital costs really dominate. Construction time is also key because it's the length of time that you have to borrow the money for before you start generating. Potential risk is also right up there, correct, because that will drive the loan, the percentage of the loan that you would have to get. Generating income. Actually, I'm going to stop there because that will be the order that I will put them in. So yay, you all passed you will get a gold certificate for passing. But that literally is the order that I would, my personal view would be that order. I think capital cost, construction time, potential risk, the income is key. Licensing is a perceived risk, but it in fact is linked very much to the kind of construction time. It's the delay in which and how long I may have to wait on my project before I get income. And in fact, I'll show you shortly, the fuel cycle cost actually does have very little impact on the overall cost. So great job, everybody. Okay, so looking just at this power station cost, I wanted to include this because, again, a lot of people have an assumption in their mind when we hear the word capital cost or power station cost. We all have this different idea what it includes and maybe what it excludes. So first of all, the power station costs typically are made up. You have to construct it, you have to buy your fuel and dispose of the fuel, you have to do operating and maintenance, you have to decommission, and of course there's the financing cost as well. So that's the overall thing that we've been talking about. So I just want to break that up a little bit more. So construction costs, definitely the largest single component, we've talked about that. But during that construction time, as I said, you have to pay interest on the money that you borrowed for that construction period. And that's known as interest during construction, IDC. And typically you can actually make up about 15% of the overall cap. So just the interest you pay on the loan during the construction period can be 15% of the overall cost. That begins to illustrate right design, constructed effectively and efficiently. That's why modularization, that's why plant learning, that's why construction learning is vital. And so what it means is that, back to what I said before, this is why interest rate assumptions are so important, because it will drive up or down that interest during construction. That's why construction time is important, as I said. But overall, the overall importance depends on how much capital cost you're going to borrow and so on. So we begin to see all of these things already. And this is why nuclear stations are so much more sensitive than fossil plants. Because if you look, the amount of capital that's needed to build a gas station is relatively small, and you construct it in maybe 2 to 3 years, very quickly, maybe less than that. And so the interest you accumulate during that time, and everybody knows gas, and so the banks are more likely to loan at lower levels. That's why it's different. When you look at the overall construction cost, though, like I said, this now looking at the capital cost, again, you often hear people talk about overnight costs. And overnight costs, really be clear they exclude the financing. This is though something just suddenly happens miraculously overnight and everything just gets built. So the overnight costs are kind of broken down here in a pie chart. They're heavily dominated by maybe 1/3 is the nuclear island, then there's the conventional island, and then there's balance of plant and so on, and then there's the construction. But again, just to be aware of, it's not only the nuclear piece. The nuclear piece is maybe 1/3, but you've still got to get everything else correct. And that's kind of the good news, is that the balance of plant and the other things, which are non-nuclear, are very much based on other experiences that you in the region, in Kenya and so forth, in the region may well have from gas stations and others. So there is learning that you can apply to nuclear, and recognising it does still make up quite a proportion of the overall costs. Bearing in mind that there are also other associated costs, planning, owners' costs like training and so on, and some of the things we talked about, borrowing cost guarantees. So I'm going to try and go through this a little bit more quickly. But this is what I think I really wanted to highlight, is in these projects there are potential risks that I've already talked about. The design, construction, regulations, political, financial, natural disasters and operational failures. And for example, under design, you may have not quite got the design finalised when you started construction, you start having to make changes. Well, that's the responsibility primarily of the vendor. So what this table just begins to try and explain is there are a series of risks, and there's some examples in the description. But bear in mind that the primary stakeholder that's involved in being responsible for that risk and mitigating and fixing that risk is not always the government, it's not always the utility. It heavily is on the utility because they're ultimately the people responsible for the overall delivery of the project. But bearing in mind there's a number of risks here, and mitigating some risks which involves a series of stakeholders, which then underlines again in the other workshop why stakeholder engagement is very clear and very key. Oops, too fast. So again, just final thing on this one is I want to highlight is that if you look at coal and gas stations, the difference between the fuel and the overall operating and maintenance cost, in coal and gas, the fuel heavily dominates. Why is that important? Well, what that means though is that when you look at the fuel cost being very susceptible to markets, like for example, we've all seen how oil and gas prices have really escalated over time, particularly because again, the conflict in Europe, that's really beginning to drive fuel prices up. Well, that's why now gas and oil is not such a good source of energy, because now I cannot possibly predict, and it's much more high fluctuation and variability in prices, and so that's what's beginning to be seen around the world. In nuclear, however, the fuel is a much lower percentage of the overall costs. So what that means is if you get the capital cost right up front, you get your O&M cost right, then what that means is you are now much less susceptible to market variations in fuel. It's really important, and again, this just begins to break down where you get the fuel cost, about 40% from the uranium ore, a little bit of enrichment and so on. But again, I just want to highlight this, is that back to that prioritisation, the fuel cycle costs are not so important because they have very much lower percentage of the overall generating cost comes from your fuel, unlike oil and gas where it's completely the way around. The final thing I just want to touch on is decommissioning and fuel management costs. A lot of people get concerned about the cost of decommissioning and the cost of fuel management. And as I said before, the things like radioactive waste management, their costs are relatively small. The other thing as well is they occur a long time in the future. Okay, so again, back to what we've learned, that items costs we incur a long time in the future don't have such much of an impact. As long as you put money aside, this is the important thing, you need to put what we call a provisioning fund or a waste management fund to one side. So in the US, there is for every kilowatt hour of energy produced, the utility has to put aside a small amount of money to go into their waste fund for the management of that. And on this next chart, there it is. So this is animated normally, but unfortunately just with the system not able to show the animation. But basically what you'll see is that this is to show that over time, the blue line, the blue curve is showing that if you put a small amount of money aside, and even if you put it into an account where you only get 2.5% interest, so a low risk fund, you begin to see how your fund you'll put aside begins to increase. So say for example, if you're unsure what the decommissioning cost is, so the red band shows me that maybe my decommissioning fund is 200 million or 400 million. Well, what this curve shows you is that after only 11 years of operation, you've already got your 200 million in the bank, so you don't have to worry about it. But what happens if the decommissioning fund wasn't 200 million? Actually, decommissioning costs are going to be 400. Well, you just continue operating, your reactor continues to operate, so you just continue to put a little bit more money aside. And you'll see then again, after 25 years, roughly speaking, you've not only now paid for all your highest estimate of your decommissioning costs, but now you're beginning to also pay off your final disposal costs and so on. So you begin to see that just by putting a little money aside, putting in a guaranteed account, this is how you provision for the future. And this is the key trick. Everybody around the world uses this approach for decommissioning funds and waste management funds, is put a little bit of money aside. So again, just to bring all this together, is to finalise the last two slides before I hand over to Winnie to talk about some of the more local items. Again, the specifics of financing nuclear power stations are heavily driven by this kind of risk, political, revenue, electricity markets and so on. And all of those are common to all energy sources. But of course, the priorities are not the same for nuclear as you've begun to see. And those risks have a major impact on the cost of financing because of the assumed interest rates, because if there's a riskier project, they'll ask for a higher return on investment. So it's really important to understand the risks, mitigate those risks, and again, you can talk, maybe it's in our session later, and in future sessions, we can talk about some of these risks in more detail and how some of the techniques you can use to mitigate those risks, and which are ones more uncertain than others. But again, this is key to the level of financing. So again, we've heard about this in the earlier talks. I just wanted to re-highlight this. There are a number of models for financing nuclear, but typically speaking, you really do need the host and maybe even the vendor governments essential in this build project, because they're the people that will be able to help with the financial structures, help with risk mitigation, maybe loan guarantees. Things like careful planning is key to this, making sure things are on time and within budget. And you can see now why, if you don't control those things, why the cost overruns have substantial impact in the long term. Therefore, you really need to minimise construction risk. And you've seen that the lessons that'll be learned from, let's say, Vogel 3 and 4 and in the US and so on, the learning curves really become vital with that. SMRs can have some advantages in that because the financing up front, the risk isn't so large because the amount of money you borrow is less. And then the final point in the end there is that there are a number of market mechanisms that you've heard about, power purchase agreements, contract for difference. The Mankala principle is again the one that they use in Finland, where everybody kind of shares in the risk. Basically, it's like a series of villages coming together. So maybe there's a regional solution, could be a possibility for Africa. So in summary, what have we learned? So nuclear energy life cycle costs of electricity are comparable to and less expensive than many other alternative clean energies. I provide you a report. Project durations are long and therefore requires a long involvement and commitment from governments because of changing politics and changing worlds. High capital cost, long planning and construction times introduce the risk, and they are the major items that affect the economics and the financing. Like I said, the risk. Capital cost dominates, whereas fuel costs are relatively low. The value of money changes with time. Things like capital cost, interest rate, discount rate are all these key assumptions that I introduced. Costs incurred in a long time in the future have little impact on decommissioning. And discount rates that do I assume 5% or 10% for my discount rate, that really accounts for the overall perception of the project risk. So, finally, given what you've now learned, from your perspective, in one word or a simple phrase, what would your priority be? What do you think you would do, either as an individual, your organisation, your country? What could you do to reduce the risk and improve the economic case for nuclear energy? So again, this is a word cloud, so your ideas are all valued. and recognised and appreciated. So let's move on to the last one. So again, just put in a single word, maybe a short phrase. What would your priority be to reduce the risk? Where would you focus your efforts? Who's going to go first? To invest now. Great answer. Invest early. That's a consistent one. National position is really important. Again, that might help drive things early. Source of funding, public support. Yeah, again, that would shorten that period up front and that risk. What else? We've got proper planning. Absolutely. Invest early now. Excellent. National support, government support. It's interesting, this national support and government support, again, and how the role of stakeholders that you heard about yesterday is vital to that. And invest early. You can only invest early and deliver these things early if you have the appropriate training in human capital development and supply chain and so on. So all these things are very much linked. It's no coincidence that this agenda has been put together in the way it has done. So thanks very much, everybody. That's great, and we really appreciate it. The thing we're talking about as well is all of your feedback and things will actually be captured in each of these sessions. Our system saves all the responses. It's anonymous, so don't worry. All your responses are anonymous, but we do have it because I think it would be useful to reflect on this in the future. So thanks very much. So with that, I will say thank you very much. Thanks for your attention and listening, and I will hand over to Winnie for the local perspectives, and then we'll come back collectively together to do the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Mr. Andy, for that very great introduction into the financing. This morning we also got some good keynote speech by Mr. Nana, and I'll be picking up from there to give the Kenyan perspective. My name is Winnie Dubai. I'm Director of Strategy and Planning at the Nuclear Power and Energy Agency, and very excited to have all of you at this summit, and to also have discussions based on our experience here in Kenya. That will be the outline of my presentation. Now that we have the US-Africa Summit, I want to start with some perspectives on the prospects for nuclear, not just in Kenya, but also in Africa. There are many countries that have an intention and are already considering the inclusion of nuclear energy in their power mix. We will now then delve into Kenya, look at the national vision and the place for nuclear energy, and then I will also be highlighting some perspectives of financing of key infrastructure projects that we are watching very closely, because it also provides some dynamics as we consider the financing of the nuclear power plant. Now, how many countries in Africa are so far considering nuclear energy? I believe that every country has got some basic level of consideration, but we have about 14 countries that have shown serious interest. Of course, we all know that South Africa, represented in this conference, is already operating 2 nuclear power plants at Kobak, and there is an intention of expanding that fleet into the future. Egypt is currently constructing 4 units at the El Dabaa nuclear site, and we are very excited as Africa to see those additions. Now, I have listed about 14 countries that have this interest, and out of the list of 14, we have 3 countries, that is Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria, that are currently in phase 2 of the IEA milestone approach. The other about 11 countries are still in phase 1 and making considerations for nuclear power program. So I want to urge all of us in the hall, especially those Africans that are represented here, let us work together to ensure that we move these programs forward. An introduction to Kenya. Kenya is an East African country with a land area of about 569,000 kilometers and a population of 53 million. Our GDP per capita is currently estimated at $2,100 US, and the GDP growth rate has been at an average of about 5.4%. This is an important figure. The electricity consumption per capita is currently at 185 kilowatt hours per capita. This is a very low number. and therefore this is a number that we seek to increase by enhancing accessibility to electricity and energy to our population and to our country. And therefore, nuclear energy provides a great opportunity as we seek to increase this number through investment in industries and also ensuring that all the households are connected. The dominant economic sectors, the biggest economic block is agriculture at 25%. We also have transport and infrastructure at 11% and manufacturing at 7.6%. This is our current electricity mix. We have a very clean or renewable mix. Our biggest share is geothermal, which is at about 963 megawatts already installed, and this is 29% of the total installed capacity. Our geothermal resource capacity is huge. We actually estimate that the country has got about 10,000 megawatts potential for electricity generation from geothermal. Hydro follows at 830 megawatts, which is 25%. Thermal, we have 698% capacity, which is 21%. Then we also have investment in wind and solar, which is currently at 13% for wind, 6% at solar. And these are investments that also continue to increase. The government has provided a good policy framework for this. We have the feed-in tariff policy that seeks in renewable energy, especially for wind and solar. We also have 6% import, mainly from Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a significant investment in hydro resources, so we currently import about 6% of our power from Ethiopia. We have an interconnection with Uganda and Tanzania, but this is mainly for power exchange as and when any of those economies require a boost in electricity. Now, Kenya is providing or investing in what we call the Kenya Vision 2030. And this is our development vision to ensure that Kenya becomes a globally competitive and prosperous nation with a high quality of life. And the target for this is also to ensure that we have a sustained economic growth. And with this, we have three pillars: the economic pillar, the social pillar, and the political pillar. And energy is a very key factor for all these three pillars because it is considered an enabler for the economic, social, and political development of the country. And therefore, when the Vision 2030 was set up, the nuclear power program was then proposed in order to meet the future demand that would be expected from investment in the various sectors of the economy. It is expected that the industrial sector will significantly increase, and therefore the power demand will be enhanced. And it is important that we have different sources of electricity that would provide the required electricity. This is the chart of our projection. We have envisaged that the electricity demand will grow significantly, and this covers the period from 2023 to 2043, and it enhances or rather highlights three scenarios: the low vision, which envisages a low economic development, so assuming that the economy does not grow at a high rate, would expect that we would grow up to 4,996 megawatts by 2043, quite pessimistic. The reference scenario, which is the blue line, indicates that we would grow up to about 7,000 megawatts. And the vision scenario, which expects that there would be significant economic growth from investment in the various sectors, and the industrial growth would be enhanced. It would grow from the current 3.2 to about 14.9. And therefore, when you consider all the current sources of electricity, those would not be adequate to meet the demand. And therefore, nuclear becomes a significant factor to fulfill that demand. And now that brings me to why nuclear for Kenya. We are requiring that even as we develop our electricity and energy sector, we require baseload generation. As our industry continue to improve and continue to and get enhanced, we require baseload electricity that would ensure that we have electricity at all times, ensuring that we do not have intermittency within our grid, and therefore nuclear answers. Also, as clearly indicated by Andy this morning, the long-term cost predictability is very key. We need to be able to manage the energy costs over time, and nuclear provides that option. As much as we have all agreed today that the capital costs for nuclear are quite significant, we have seen that the operational costs are pretty low. And therefore, nuclear will provide some good stability in the energy prices, and therefore becomes a very good option when you want to maintain a stability in the electricity prices. There are also significant environmental benefits because nuclear is a clean technology. Kenya has very ambitious climate goals, and to ensure that we have a low carbon energy mix, and therefore nuclear has also been established to answer that question. There is also potential for flexibility and integration with other energy services. We know that the International Atomic Energy Agency and many other agencies are currently conducting a lot of studies on the integration of nuclear with renewables. And therefore, we see a great potential for that integration, as well as the great potential for other uses for nuclear. For example, the desalination, and also being able to provide thermal heat for the industries. Great benefits would emanate from this. And therefore, we are very clear in Kenya that nuclear is a good option, and we would be able to answer all these questions. Now, let me introduce a perspective on Kenya's electricity pricing model. We have seen that the cost of financing of a nuclear power project will definitely have a big impact on the tariff and vice versa. So the two are really related. So we have an electricity regulatory body that is called the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. EPRA is established under the Energy Act 2019 and is mandated to provide technical and economic regulation in the electricity sector, and the project then is implemented. Our current model has an allowable rate of return, which is usually equated to the weighted average cost of capital. And the weighted average cost of capital is an average of the debt ratio times the cost of the debt, and then you add the ratio of the equity and multiply by the cost of the equity. So then we get the weighted average cost of capital, and that is what the regulatory body gives as the allowable rate of return for any investment. Any electricity or energy project in Kenya follows that mechanism. The regulator has also provided for the optimal ratio between debt and equity, currently set at 70% for debt and 30% for equity. And for debt, the regulator usually considers the actual cost of the debt. Of course, there's a lot of checks and balances that go into ascertaining the cost of debt that is presented by the investor. When we come to the equity, the allowable rate of equity is currently 10.5%, and that is mainly for the public utility regulated entities. Our current electricity mix is such that the biggest share of electricity generation is by a public utility called the Kenya Electricity Generating Company. Currently, they have about 70% of the market share, and we have 30% of the share taken up by the independent power producers. So public utilities then get a cost of equity at 10.5%, and this is based on the capital asset pricing model that they present to the regulatory body. So that is just a framework to understand our current pricing model. So if you look at the areas that I have been able to go through, it is very clear that the cost of financing of a nuclear power plant will become very key in setting the tariff that would be allowable to the nuclear power plant investor. And therefore, for us and UPEA, since we are the Nuclear Energy Program implementing organization, at this early point, we are very keen to ensure that we are carrying out financial analysis consistently and adequately, given the information that come to us mainly from the vendors. Kenya is such a small, we have a small grid, as you have seen, 3.2 gigawatt, and therefore our prospects are greatly for small and modular reactors. And as we know, there's still a big debate on the competitiveness or what the actual numbers for SMRs are, but we have been in touch with a lot of the vendors to just ensure that we continuously update our financial analysis models. So I would want to present some aspects of key infrastructure projects that have been done in this country. And the reason for this is because they will present some options that we would be able to follow in the financing of a nuclear power plant. When we invest in the nuclear power plant, this will perhaps be the biggest project that will have been undertaken in Kenya. But we are taking a lot of lessons, learning a lot from projects that have been done, and especially those that have been done successfully. So the first project that I want to discuss in a general perspective is geothermal power plants. And as I've said, Kenya has got a significant geothermal resource at about 10,000 megawatts. And so in the energy sector, there's been a significant investment in geothermal projects, both by the public utility KenGen and the independent power producers. So when we look at how KenGen has been financing their geothermal power plants, this has been mainly through concessional funding, and the funding model requires that we have a debt component of 70% and 30% for the equity. So KenGen will get development financing, mainly from African Development Bank or AFD, KFW, JICA. Those are the kind of investments that we have seen in the geothermal sector. And I think I need also to highlight the government policy on geothermal has also been very positive, because the government has completely de-risked steam exploration. The upfront cost of exploration and exploitation of geothermal steam is very expensive, and it's also a very risky affair, because the exploration requires the drilling of wells with a potential for steam, and sometimes the potential is not met. So you could find an investment of $1 million per well, $1 million per well, and sometimes the output of steam may not be as expected, or sometimes the steam may not be economic to be able to connect into the generation of electricity. And so what the government did, they established a special purpose vehicle. It's called the Geothermal Development Company, that carries out the upfront work of steam exploration and steam exploitation. And once the steam is availed, it is availed to the public utility KenGen and also to the independent power producers. Then we will have the project financing of the actual project, and that's the one that I've said KenGen mainly invests in concessional funding, and of course the government share, which is usually 30%. What about the independent power producers? Now, we have a significant interest by IPPs in this sector, but their cost of equity is definitely much more. As you know, that the IPPs would not be able to access concessional loans as the public utility would be, and therefore we see significant cost of projects done by the independent power producers. And there is more interest in investment by the public utility, because then the tariff and the energy cost is maintained at a lower level. The other project that I would want to discuss is not an energy project, but this is one of the biggest projects, again, done in the country and very successfully. This is the Standard Gauge Railway, and this is a project which is a railway line that connects the city and also the outskirts. So we have the current phase 1 project that was an investment of a standard gauge railway line from Mombasa, which is the coastal city, to Nairobi. And phase 2 is actually seeking to connect to an area that is outside Nairobi called Naivasha. So phase 1 project cost was about 3.8 billion. This was implemented under a public-private partnership framework. Again, the government has provided a very good policy framework for projects that can jointly be implemented between the public and the private. And this project has been very successful, and we have seen a lot of efficiency in transportation of goods and persons. So the funding model, again, was a mix of government and also concessional loans. So again, we see consistent implementation of huge projects using the concessional elements, and that makes the project affordable. The other project I want to discuss is actually one of the biggest ones that the government is currently implementing. This is called the LAPSET project. It is Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor. And this is a project that interconnects 3 countries, that is Kenya, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. And it is an infrastructure project that has got several elements. There is a road network, there is a standard gauge railway, there are ports, there are resort cities. So it is a project that has got very many elements. And collectively, this project is estimated to cost about $25 billion. Again, the Kenyan bit of investment is being done under government investment and again concessional loans. And we are currently implementing phase 1 of this project that is expected to be implemented over several years. The other project I want to discuss is the Nairobi Expressway. I believe most of you who may have come from the airport might have used the Nairobi Expressway, which is a 27-kilometer road link from the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to Nairobi Central Business District, as well as other areas surrounding Nairobi. Again, this has been seen as a very successful project because it has eased transportation within the city, making transportation very efficient. The project cost was 600 million, and this was again implemented under a public-private partnership model with financing again from a concessionaire who is going to manage the project for about 25 years and then be able to hand over to the government. So this is a build, own, and transfer model. The last project I would want to discuss, this has not been a successful project, and there are lots of lessons that we have to learn from the project aspect as well as the financing aspect of the project. So this is the Lamu coal plant that was estimated at about 1,050 megawatts at a cost of $2 billion. Again, very significant. And the thing about this project is that there was already financing, there was financial closure for this project. So financing was not a problem. There was a power purchase agreement in place. However, there were issues that emanated from stakeholders. There were issues raised on environment and the impact, negative impact on the environment from the coal power plant. There were also legal challenges on the project. And initially there was financing difficulties, and even being able to reach a close on the power purchase agreement was quite difficult, but that was eventually done. So the main reason why the project was halted was because of the environmental concerns and the raising of issues by the stakeholders. So we learned lessons that it is really important to carry out a thorough and consistent risk assessment and management approach, because the risks within a project will change over time, and there is also a very dire need for effective stakeholder engagement. And the stakeholder engagement will have to be consistent throughout the planning and the implementation of the project, which then now brings me to narrow down on the risks that we have been able to evaluate and continue to evaluate for Kenya's nuclear power program. One of the things that have become very clear to us is that every risk for nuclear is a financial risk. Every risk that we experience at whatever stage of the project can result to an impact on the price of, or the cost of the project, and therefore the price of electricity that would be would emanate from the project. And so as we continue to develop our nuclear power program, we are very critical of the need for risk analysis at the various stages. At the pre-construction stage, we have to ensure that we evaluate and manage the risks that are associated with the regulatory framework. We are a phase 2 country that is still developing the regulatory framework, and I'm very happy to see our Director General of the regulatory framework here. And we are constantly in discussion on what needs to be done to ensure a robust regulatory framework, because it will have an impact on the cost of the nuclear power plant, and also the confidence that would be presented to the potential investors. Environmental risks have been also raised at this very early stage. Our CEO yesterday did indicate that we have carried out a social, environmental, and environmental study, and there has been a lot of questions raised about the output of that process. The strategic and social assessment is a requirement by the environmental law. So we are required to be able to undertake that assessment, to be able to provide to the country an evaluation of the impact of the nuclear power program to the economy and also to the social aspects of the country. And we are still answering questions regarding the issues that are covered in that report. So again, that could present a risk that needs to be managed at the very early stage. As I said, we are carrying out financial analysis and looking at robust and optimal financing models that we shall use for our plant. And at the construction stage, we have been able to see from Mr. Worrell's presentation this morning the big impact of project delays and cost overruns. We have seen that the interest during construction for a nuclear power plant could go up to 15%. And that is even before you manage to sell 1 unit of electricity. So again, that is a big source of risk that needs to be managed. There are also issues of public and legal challenges that could come through the construction phase. Again, at the operational phase, we continue to face operational and safety risks, which I know the nuclear world manages very, very well. And also, it is important to keep a good eye on the decommissioning phase. As much as it is fine to the future, it could present a risk and a challenge that could be brought up to the project. We have some proposals on how to manage, especially these nuclear project risks. We have seen over time the need for political stability to provide a good environment for investment in nuclear projects. There is need to ensure a stable and supportive political environment. As we look into nuclear financing, there's an element that always comes that is the political risk premium. And if the political risk is seen to be high, then that number will likely go up and will cause an enhancement in the cost of the project. Strong government support is key. The commitment to policy and financial support is very key because, again, it provides confidence to investors, and it also provides a good environment to ensure that all requirements for the nuclear power program are put in place in good time and that the nuclear program is managed efficiently. It is also important, as we have seen, for government where possible to incentivize investment in nuclear projects. This will definitely bring down the cost of financing and therefore have a positive impact on the project. The regulatory framework is very, very key. There's need to develop a robust regulatory framework because this minimizes the risks, it minimizes the delays, it also provides a lot of confidence to the investors. Stakeholder engagement is also very important. Yesterday we had a very interesting and engaging session on stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders can stop a project if they are not managed well. Therefore, it is important to build public trust and acceptance. And as we saw yesterday from Bassett and Ms. Delia, communication and continuous engagement will bring a positive impact on the project. As we explore an optimal financing plan for Kenya, we are undertaking, as I said, continuous financial analysis. we continue to engage the vendors and potential vendors for numbers and also assumptions that we use in our models. We are carrying out financial analysis based on the output of reactor technology assessment. My colleague whom you saw yesterday, Engineer Ohaga, has a team that is consistently and continuously undertaking reactor technology assessment. And based on the ranking of the various technologies that are currently there and upcoming, then we run some financial analysis on those models or on the technologies that are provided. So there has to be a good link that are still at the early stage. There has to be a good link between your financial analysis and the technical analysis that is being done. This could be done by different teams, so there's need for some synchronization of the technical team carrying out the reactor technology assessment and the team that would be carrying out the economic and financial analysis. So we are able to use an IEA tool that is called Cost of Nuclear Energy Spreadsheet. It is a basic tool that still is able to give us some answers to the potential tariff or potential cost of the project. We are also able to carry out sensitivity analysis and be able to make comparison of the various technologies that we currently have. I need to say that Kenya is looking forward to having great financing innovations. I think Mr. Nana did provide some good, I was very excited to see some of the options that are being considered and also being implemented in terms of financing nuclear power projects. We really have to be very innovative in the nuclear world so that we are able to have innovation in financing that will be able to open up the space for financing of the nuclear power projects. Finally, I would not want to leave this stage without talking about a very key element, especially for newcomer and embarking countries. We have talked about the financing part of the project, and that is when you're beginning the bidding and the construction and commissioning of the project. However, the stage at which we are at in Kenya and in most African countries, we are developing our nuclear infrastructure. And for those following the IEA milestone approach, when you look at financing, it's also coupled with an element called funding. So we always evaluate the funding and financing of the nuclear power plant, power program. So I want to talk about the funding element, ensuring the provision of resources to build the requisite infrastructure to support the nuclear power project. And these are the 19 infrastructure issues that have got cost elements even before you begin the construction of the project. So we need to keep a very keen eye on the provision of resources for these elements of infrastructure, because then it will dictate the success of the project. If the infrastructure program or the infrastructure issues are not well funded, you will not have a national position. You will not number to the government for the resource requirements for infrastructure, because then during the cycle, the resources will be provided when there is a clear outline of program. So as I conclude, I want to say that Kenya is very committed to developing sustainable and economic nuclear energy program, and that's why we are very keen on financing innovations to be able to optimize the financing plan that we will settle on, and also to emphasize the need for long-term planning and also to manage the risk at all stages of the nuclear power program. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Winnie. That's so hopefully that's given you an indication, like from the introductory remarks.
I have a couple of questions. Considering the climate goals and what is going on right now, because we want to engage in about gas where the fuel cost is a bit higher for that. How does that compare with renewables? Because that's where, like it or not, our government can easily give us support for, or even some financing institutions can easily give us support for. And in the nuclear industry is a bit of a hard sell. So we need to get a bit of how to come up in that aspect. I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so since we realize that there are a number of people who would want to ask questions, let's limit our questions. So there are 3 from one person, if we could have one.
For nuclear to consistently remain competitive against the other sources. But I also want to say that even in the planning process, we have to make a consideration for inclusion of both baseload and renewable energies, which most we know are intermittent. So there is a very clear place for baseload technologies because there has to be a
presentation, Dr. Winnie. In Kenya, we are interested in small and modular, and this can be broken down so that we don't invest it, do a single investment once, but incremental approach so that the risks are minimized along the way. Then the last question to Dr. Winnie, we've seen your presentation, and one of the risk management strategy that Kenyan has is by doing upfront, that is drilling wells. What strategy as Nupea has maybe in plan for de-risking so that we encourage the investors in this area? Thank you.
So in terms of the absolutely right, I would say there's a huge benefit, and you can read many books on this, but the idea of small modular reactors is that first of all, you can build one, and the finance that you would need for a smaller reactor is smaller. Therefore, the risk is smaller because you may be able to get that financing from more sources, because you maybe have to only borrow $1 billion, not $10 billion, for example. But the other thing as well is if you have an expectation, there are several benefits, because if you build one and then you learn from that, then the learning on the next one would mean you build it more quickly, and you've now produced not only the infrastructure that we mentioned previously, but also the supply chain and the learning and so on. So now the cost and the timescale will come down for Unit 2. So there's benefits there. The other thing that comes with that is, though, that the revenue that you are now making on Unit 1, you can begin to invest the revenue you want into Unit 2 to pay off the debt for that. And so that if you build a third and a fourth and an nth, you can see how your learning and your costs improve, but also the investment you pass on. So it shares the risk, but also you can share the financial benefits and the profit that's being made. So that means you borrow less as you go. So that's definitely one thing. But I think also the important part about that, the incremental, is you build up the supply chain, the licensing regulator, the public perception, all the other things that come as secondary benefits. So I agree there's many benefits to that.
Thank you again for the question. In terms of the risk of the nuclear power program in Kenya, I believe that the establishment of the NEPIO, which is an agency, provides a good bridge of the risk element, especially at the upfront stage. Because the NEPIO has been established to basically prepare the infrastructure for the nuclear power program. Therefore, we are ensuring that all the 19 infrastructure issues are well developed, up to the point that the government will be ready to identify the owner-operator, which is part of even the de-risking. Because if you look at the institutional setup of the nuclear power program, we have the NEPIO in the beginning to do all the infrastructure, and then we have the regulatory body, which was already established through the Kenya Nuclear Regulatory Act of 2019. So we already have a regulatory body in place. And the next stage then will be to establish an owner-operator organization that will own and operate the nuclear power plant. So since the owner-operator will be mainly focused on the project, they should be able to find a space where the basic infrastructure or the relevant infrastructure for the project will already in place. We will already have a good evaluation of the radiation protection framework, nuclear safety framework, legislation will already be done or underway. So I believe this establishment of a focused organization to evaluate and establish relevant infrastructure is a big win. And perhaps for countries that may be here and do not have a specific organization just focused on doing the upfront evaluation and implementation, I think it's a very good idea because it keeps the program very focused, and there's also progress that is assessed at that early stage.
So we'll take 2 questions. We have to go for lunch, so that
Okay, thank you.
I'm going ahead of the president in respect of protocol because he speaks last. So again, I'm Altrin Obiro from Kenya, Ministry of Interior, and Thank you for the presentations that you did, quite informative. Mine is a reference on a keynote address that was done by His Excellency Dr. Amani Abu Zaid, African Union delegate, during the awareness on advancing Africa's sustainability through economic development and building nuclear capacity, like advancing for nuclear energy for African countries to achieve their 2063 agenda. So based on that, how do you see the potential of Kenya and other countries within the region exploiting that opportunity, and seeing the role of organizations like AU or AFCON in advocating for policies and mobilizing the resources to support their country initiatives? So when you look at that, has NUPEA seen or exploited ways to partner with AU to mobilize those resources, or to see how to champion the agenda best to establish those policy frameworks that it needs to strengthen in the various areas of infrastructure, the 19 infrastructure areas that you talked about? So is that a possibility that you've looked to partner with AU through the relevant government structures? Another thing is, how have you seen AFCON and their role within the region as a key player in strengthening your mandate through the structures they have to mobilize resources for capacity building and awareness as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Trinh, for that question. Indeed, you did point out the critical role of especially the organizations that have been established within the African networks. And I want to start by saying of AFCON, we are very keen to have a regional approach to advocate and support each other as African countries for the advancement of nuclear. However, I feel that there's still a big potential for AFCON to be able to bring the region together within that collaborative framework. And I know that there are lots of efforts that have been propelled even by organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency to just ensure that we have a robust collaboration framework within the AFCON. Again, within the African Union, Kenya is a very active participant within the African Union. And as you know, we are vouching for chairmanship of that. And we are very keen to ensure a collaborative African engagement on nuclear. There is a lot of capacity building that could be shared across the board. And I think what is working very actively at this point is the International Atomic Energy Agency regional projects that I'm sure most of the African countries here participate in, because it provides a good framework for collaboration, for exchange of ideas, for sharing best practices and learning from other countries. So I believe that the regional approach that is also advocated by the IAEA has got a good platform that could be adopted by AFCON and AU. I don't think we are doing enough, but NUPEA and Kenya would be very happy to see that advanced for the benefit of our economies.
If I could add one very quick comment. I'm a huge supporter of regional solutions, not just for Africa but elsewhere. Even in the US, for example, where we're based in from Oak Ridge National Laboratory on the east side of Tennessee. Tennessee Valley Authority is a large nuclear component and also hydro and others, so it has similarities actually. But one of the interesting things is that the whole region is now looking at nuclear. Some US states have lifted their moratorium on nuclear, and so they're interested in nuclear. The very strong message is that each of those states, it makes no sense for them to do it all on their own, because there isn't probably the need to develop an entire supply chain in an isolated sense. But there is tremendous benefit, the synergy in just within the US states working together and identifying strengths that they each offer. There is a huge market potential, enough for everybody to participate. It doesn't need to be about over necessary competition and infighting. And I would express that similar observation from the US states to Africa, in everybody participating and finding regional solutions. And even, you mentioned the IAA, there's even been papers published on regional solutions even to the waste issue. You know, regional repository is another solution. So I think, I'm all of the above in terms of that as a regional solution. Do we have time for that extra question? One last one. We are between lunch and everybody, so.
Thank you very much, both presenters, for your excellent presentations. My name is David Otuoma, the current president of the Nuclear Society of Kenya, but you're only 1 month old. Two questions, one for the USA, one for Kenya. So for the USA, in USA you have champions for nuclear. When I say champions, you'll find the senators in USA, the governors, the senators especially, whether it is Republican or Democrat, they'll take bills to parliament, not to the Congress, House or Senate, and things go through to get support for nuclear and what have you. Now, coming to Kenya, we don't have champions. What we have, when they are in, our National Assembly is a big letdown. When they are in parliament, we are the ones who take bills to them through the executive, and the Kenya Nuclear Regulatory Authority here can attest, because we formed the Eastern Africa Radiation Protection way back in 1999. I was the first chairman there also, and through the time we pushed through these bills and what have you, it was only in 2019 we got the Nuclear Regulatory Act. Now the second question to Kenya now. This is your relation with associations and societies. Please, can we emulate the Americans? They have the American Nuclear Society, and we are so privileged the president is here with us. Can we emulate, we work together? Because if you want to see the cabinet secretary or member of parliament, you have to get permission as a director from your CEO, get permission from your principal secretary, get permission from your cabinet secretary. I, being in the university and the president of Nuclear Society of Kenya, I don't need permission from my chairman, my vice chancellor. I only get my young students. We go to parliament. We see the members of parliament, we see the cabinet secretary, and we push the way we did the Nuclear Regulatory Act. Your comments, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Utoma, for that question. Indeed, there's a lot of merit and a lot of progress that we can make if we collaborate, especially now that we have a lot of nuclear organizations. We have the Kenya Young Generation in Nuclear, whose president is here, Women in Nuclear Kenya, I'm the president. We now have the Nuclear Society of Kenya. These are great opportunities for progression of the nuclear power program and nuclear applications. So my comment is that, yes, there is a lot of positive outcome from all these organizations coming together, and I'm very happy that we have now established a Nuclear Society of Kenya, because then the society should play the role of spearheading the collaboration of all these other networks and organizations that have nuclear applications. So I look forward to you as the president of Nuclear Society of Kenya spearheading this, because there is a lot of gain that will come out of that. And for Women in Nuclear Kenya, I want to offer my support and also congratulations for that appointment and establishment, and assure you that we are going to work together with you, because it's going to be a game changer, even about on stakeholder engagement issues, on advocating for nuclear, on answering issues pertaining to nuclear. And you've also pointed out, I believe Andy's coming to answer that on the US perspective. We need the legislators to understand and also support the nuclear applications. They have a very key role towards ensuring that we have a good framework, but majority of them may not have the necessary information to even be able to propose the bills. So I think we have a responsibility to ensure that proper bills are proposed, but we will need those legislators to understand and also be at the forefront of proposing the bills within Parliament. So we look forward there. I know there are so many regulations that are lined up by the Kenya Nuclear Regulatory Authority, and we need to work together within nuclear organizations, nuclear societies, to be able to ensure that proper legislative framework and regulatory framework is established. Thank you.
If I could stand. If I can just answer the US question comment, is that what struck me only very recently in my career, I've been at Oak Ridge 12 years, previous that was with the UK industry, it only occurred to me recently that it's not the US government at the federal level that sets nuclear direction and policy, which I think from the outside world it does appear to be such, because you hear about the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy. It's actually the state level. So this is why I mentioned the states earlier. So in one of my capacities, the Deputy Director of an initiative called GAIN, I'll talk about that another time, but we're doing a lot of work at the state level and engaging actually with state legislators. So these state legislators are the people who write the bills at the state level. And some of them are coming in with a nuclear focus. But I would always advocate for them to come in with a clean, secure, affordable energy focus. And it's up to us as nuclear advocates to prove that nuclear technology can fit those three and maybe other criteria. The other important point though is that if I say it as a nuclear advocate, I work in the nuclear industry, or if a Westinghouse or another company says that, it will carry some weight. But if people who are outside of nuclear say it, about I want nuclear because of, and then they can list it, whether it's the public, investors, maybe even end users, like we heard about Microsoft and of steel companies. If end users can come forward and advocate for nuclear, that is way bigger voice than nuclear ever will be, because everybody turns to the nuclear industry and says, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, because you're conflicted of interest and so on. So I would definitely say that the voice needs to come from everybody. The independent voices are way more important than ourselves. And nuclear is not the only answer, it's all of the above. And so that's why all voices are important. And Alicia Duncan opened very clearly with the message of diversity, and that includes diversity not in just in gender and ethnicity and others, but also diversity in markets, diversity in voices from different industries speaking up. That would be my comment. I know we're running out of time.
All right, so yes, you can do it better for them, for Andy and Winnie. And please, you can come for your chocolates. Sure. And then we also have a presentation, gifts for them. Okay, so you're going to get your gifts as your speaker gifts is going to come up in a bit. So let's bring the gifts now. Nana was also supposed to get his gift, but he's not around, so we'll just present the two. Okay, so we have the Director General for Kenra, Chumba Keta, who's going to help with the presentations. So you will hand them over, and then you pose for the photographs. Okay, thank you. And then another one for Andy. Thank you very much, sir. Oh, please, sure. Okay, so we're breaking for lunch. A quick announcement. There are a number of you who picked up the tags for your colleagues. But you're holding on to them, and the team is having to reprint. So if you have your colleagues' tags, let them know that you have their tags, so that they don't have to go and ask for another one to be printed for them. So we're going for lunch now, and we overran our time a bit, but let's please endeavor to be back at 1 p.m. so we can continue with the rest of the session. Thank you very much. We're having lunch at the same place where we had lunch yesterday, which is, I believe, the second floor. Yeah. All right. So I'll see you guys after lunch. Enjoy your lunch.
need everyone to move quickly to lunch. Please do not sit here. Move quickly to lunch. The chef has already been upstairs to see why his food is not being eaten. Please hurry to lunch. The food's been sitting. The chef is not happy. You all go eat some delicious food.
Yes.